Sadhu Pranam, dear friends. I am Abhas Maldaya, and I am here today to discuss about whether Mughals made India rich or they plundered and looted us. So, this is coming out of a context of a debate between Mr. Javed Akhtar and Mr. Tariq Fateh, where it was all about whether the same subject which I am going to discuss about. Post the debate, this all things got into the Twitter, and I went on to cite a lot of references from primary sources which cry out loud to say that, hey, Mughals never made us rich. Rather, they were plundering and looting us. And so, to justify my points, I thought of why not make a video and put across everything because not everyone is reading the Twitter threads and the articles. So, before I dwell much into it, I will like to cite out my sources so that no one questions that you come up with an orange book and whatnot. But to speak about the books which I have read or came across are the works of S.M. Ikram, Columbia University Press, works of Irfan Habib, Cambridge Press, Angus Madison's work, which everyone has been quoting, Richard Vaughan Galbraith, Paul Joseph, Abul Fazl II, and Satish Chandra, everyone's favorite, and Elliot Dawson, Abraham Medali, and many more. So, but all these sources, which everyone is busy quoting, somehow narrates a very different story what they are interested to quote. So, if I first start off my conversation today with a very basic fact that whether Mughals were here to go back or they just became one of us and they loved India so much. So it all starts with Babur, isn't it? The story goes on that Babur was so much in love with India that he decided to stay back over here, and that's why he established his empire over here. And with the time, whatever his generation did, it was for India, and it was not anything for their sultanate. So, at the starting, I would like to break the myth that no, Babur had no option but to stay back in India. It was he had no choice. So to start off with, for this we need to really look into the primary sources, and for in this case the primary sources should be none other than the works Babarnama itself. But before I go into what Babarnama writes about the things, as just at the starting point, I would like to quote Mr. SM, SM Ikram in his book Muslim Civilization in India, very clearly says that Babur paid attention towards India because only because he had lost everything in Samarkand. It is a paraphrase statement. One can definitely go through the book and it has got even more details. Now, after putting across this statement, a bold one, breaking the myth that he had come here to be one of us, I will now go into his own writing, that is Babur Nama. And definitely, I have not used the original version, I have been using a translated version. So, let me start explaining from it. If one goes through it on the page number 358, you will understand that Babur was forced to take refuge in Bukhara. It had become impossible for him to maintain footing in Samarkand and he moved to Hisar along with his family. He had lost it completely. Further, if you go on to read on page number 479 to 480, Babur Nama English translation, Babur mentions himself to be the third Tamtana conqueror of Hindustan, first being Muhammad Mahmud. He clearly states of how he was gulfed in crisis and his Kandahar, Kabul were badly needed. Now, he further goes on to describe about India and it explains a lot. He explains about India, and this can be read on page number 519 to 520, complete description of India, where he says that India is a land full of abundant gold and silver. He even talks about easily available workforce. He even goes on to say that he he was able to generate terrific revenue which were because of the obedient nature of the Indian subjects. So again, these all are coming from the English translation of Babar Nama from page number 520 to 21. I would like Mr. Javed Akhtar to go through it. So he even gives a complete description of the revenue which is being, which he is able to generate from the Indian subjects. He has given the numbers too, which is too huge. Now, further, if one goes through these details, it becomes very clear. These 3 points becomes very clear that he had no control back home, easy revenue in India for the docile nature of people, and access to the abundant wealth which was scattered in India. India was a golden bird, right? Every one of us knows it. So Babur had technically no reason to return back. Now, coming back to other myths which has been propagated about Babur, is that Babur was invited by Rana Sanga. So for this again, one will need to inquire a bit, do a bit of analysis of the work with the other side, or the one who thinks that Mughals made India rich have been quoting. So as a primary source, one needs to go through Babarnama, and for the source which the people on the other side, or the people who have been trying to glorify Mughals, is the work of Mr. G.N. Sharma, where he has written a beautiful book of the relationship between the Mewar and the Mughals. Now, what gets interesting is that Babur was not writing his diary during this period. He was not capturing any events of his whole day. So there is no point he would have written that Rana Sanga has written a letter sending out an invitation to him. So it's nowhere mentioned. But we find one mention in the translated note, not by the words of Babur, but in the translated note we find the mention of Rana Sanga inviting Babur. Now, one definitely must not believe into the translator's note because it's again an opinion. Now, further going on to the work of Mr. G.N. Sharma, where he quotes the Rajput chroniclers. He mentions that now it was Mr. Babur who invited who wanted Rana Sanga to fight on his part to defeat Ibrahim Lodi, the common enemy. Further, Mr. G.N. Sharma goes on to even explain that why it is even illogical to claim that Babur would have been invited by Rana Sanga, because Rana Sanga was a great warrior. He was a brave man who was giving a big challenge to everyone around. And he is one of the emperor who has been spoken about in Babur Nama by Babur that he considers to be one of the most powerful king. So there is no question that why Rana Sanga should write or invite Babur. Now, further, G.N. Sharma gives the detail of what Babur had written to Rana Sanga about a certain kind of agreement. Then we can find one liner about what Rana Sanga replied. That one liner says that Rana Sanga agreed as per the Rajput chronicler. Then again, now we don't know who was that Rajput chronicler. We don't know what was the text that Rana Sanga wrote. It's a juxtaposition which has been put by even Mr. G.N. Sharma that yes, perhaps Rana Sanga would have agreed and the agreement would have been made. This idea reinforces the claim of the Mughal glorifying people that later Rana Sanga betrayed Babur by not taking part on his side. And Babur kind of attacking Rana Sanga was very much justified. He had no enmity or he had no kind of evil thought in his mind, but it was just because Rana Sanga did a bad treatment of breaking an agreement, of breaking the breach, so it happened. But it is again not feasible. We don't have any primary source. History owes nothing but to the fact, and facts comes out of the primary sources. One needs to dwell into the primary sources. So this myth that Rana Sanga invited Babur is completely busted. Now, for the let's go into the economic benefits or something if at all Mughals did to us or they further ruined it. So now before I jump into the Angus Madison works, the tables and the jargons which clearly justify that Mughals were looting India and not making us rich, I'll just like to go into a few more primary sources which talks about the administrative system and the economic policies of the Mughals. So, if I first go on to mention Francois Bernier, he was a person who visited the court of Aurangzeb. Gives a complete description of what was happening in the Mughal Empire. He has been quite critical of Aurangzeb, and there's a lot to read about, but I will just pick one part right now, where he says that a lot of gold and silver is flowing in India as business exchange. But further, he goes on to mention clearly that it only suffices the royal Mughals and condition of peasants, labourers, and other working class always remained in disdain. So again, this whole myth of that GDP share was increasing and all those goes to the dust, because yes, okay, their GDP share was increasing. They were increasing the GDP share of country, that is the Mughal Sultanate that time, but somehow people were becoming poorer. When we talk about Aurangzeb, we must not forget that Aurangzeb is known to have sent out a lot of wealth to Makkah. And in fact, Akbar can also be found, as per the primary sources, that he was really sending out a lot of wealth to Makkah. So the GDP, what was being earned or created for the India, was serving somewhere else. And also, okay, now I think that I should bring in Angus Madison right now, because that will clarify a lot more things. As per Angus Madison's understanding and what data he has put across, it was in 1600 AD that our GDP share for the first time got below China drastically. It it was for the first time when China beat us in terms of GDP share. Now, when before the Islamic invasions, our GDP share was around 32.4%. Further, it goes on to become 24.4%, and the time when Mughal took it over, it was already 24.4%. Now, around 1820 AD, it became 16%, and in 1700 AD, it was at its peak. It was quite high. But while the GDP share was high in 1700 AD, the other thing what we really need to look at is GDP per capita growth. It's for the first time our GDP per capita growth became negative only under the Mughals. That is from 1500 to 1820 as per the work of Angus Madison. So now going back to what Francois Bernier is saying, it is completely justified. While the gold and silver was only for the royal Mughals, the peasants and the laborers and all the working class were having a horrible life out there. Now, Mughal have been appreciated even for a great infrastructure, and of this a bit off the track, but Sher Shah Suri has been appreciated. So he finds appreciation for building the Grand Trunk Road, and the whole credit goes on to him. But if one has been curious enough about the history, one has been following history holistically with certain purpose and objective, then one will know that the very road what Sher Shah Suri retrofit for his own working, because you can't live in a place and not have infrastructure. Wherever you are living, you will develop the infrastructure. But this road was existing even below Sher Shah Suri. It was existing from the time of Chandragupta Maurya. It was called the Uttar Patha, and perhaps even more earlier. So it was existing somewhere around 300 BC, while we are making a claim of it being coming in 16th to 17th century, which is again baseless. So there was no point that Sher Shah Suri gave us the road. Even the thing called rupiah finds the first description in the work of Panini. It was not the Sher Shah Suri. So again, there's a lot of myths which have been imposed upon us to make us believe that yes, Mughals were making rich and we were just too poor back then. But now, further moving ahead of Sher Shah Suri, but the takeaway should be that India had a very advanced road network because trade was unavoidable for the richest country of the world. India was richest, definitely. Even Angus Madison work states it. So it will be foolish to say that Mughals gave road to India. They added, in fact, they were adding infrastructure just as a retrofitting to the existing, not for India or the Bharat, but for their own revenues. Today I'm going to be quoting only from the works which not even the leftists or the Mughal lovers can deny. So now the next book which I will be quoting would be the Cambridge Economic History of India, and one of the editors being Mr. Irfan Habib. So now what he has to say about the economic policies by then. Irfan Habib mentions about forced productions of various, including Asaf Khan for their own financial benefits. He even talks about extortion and gives example of Shaista Khan and Prince Azimun Shah. Now, it can be read on page number 183 of the book I quoted. Irfan Habib further gives account of money hoarding at large scale by Mughal emperors, including Akbar. He quotes D. Light, who mentions Akbar's treasure to be around 522.4 million florins and Sarista Khan to have hoarded around rupees 380 million. So, do we call this blooming of economy? I don't see it blooming because it was all about money hoarding. Now, Irfan Habib further talks of one way of flow of wealth during Mughal reign, that is from outer provinces to the central parts of empire. He states that the Mughal Empire was a machine to extract the resources. Now, that's very interesting because Mughal Empire was acting as a machine to extract the resources, and that's how the wealth of Golconda was drained completely. So one will find a lot of details if one goes through the book from page number 183 to page number 187. Irfan Habib mentions that for stating how he mentions that how Baniyas had to keep wealth secret for them not to become wealth of Mughal officers. So they had to hide the resources, hide the wealth. Irfan Habib talks about extortion and tendency to not return loan taken from the merchants. Merchants were always lived in fear of showing the wealth they had. They always felt that if they will be showing the wealth they are having, it will be taken away by the Mughals. So definitely life of merchants was horrible in the Mughal period, and the even Irfan Habib is not denying it. Irfan Habib further quotes Fryer to talk about the corruption at the clerical level. He says that besides Jakat, that is 1/14 of the traveller's income, heavy toll tax was imposed. It's a myth that Aurangzeb had removed the toll tax. There was nothing as such. He quotes Thevenot to talk about the excessive tolls. Now, he further goes on to say that besides jizya, duty of 5% was imposed on Hindus, while Muslims paid only 2.5%. So there were discrimination based on religion in the time of Aurangzeb to a great extent. This was evil intention of Aurangzeb as he was wanting more and more Hindus to be converted. He thought that if the tax differences will exist, then perhaps more conversion will happen. And not to forget that Irfan Habib further mentions that to explain that Hindus were often treated with inhumanity and neglect because of their adhesion to the principles of a religion which is different from that of the state. So this was happening under the Mughal reign, and we say that Mughal emperor of the period was a glorious one. Now, did decline of Mughals led to the downfall of Indian economy, as many have been quoting? But again, if one reads the same book, just the book of Irfan Habib is enough to demolish the whole claim of that Mughals were making India rich and everything can be covered. Irfan Habib has categorically mentions that wars and the Mughal desire to conquer was a major reason for the economic failure of India, followed by their own decline. Moreover, the tyranny of the governors was causing merchants to shut the business. Now let's talk a bit about Akbar. To start off with, let me quote again from the works of Irfan Habib, where so in the early years of his life, Akbar suppressed a lot of Muslim sects that were considered that were condemned by the orthodoxy and considered as a heretical. So, if I read from exactly from his book, it says that, however, during the same period, he had manifestly suppressive attitude towards the Muslim sects, condemned by the Orthodox as heretical. The Iranian nobles, mostly Shias, were encouraged and used against the discontent Turanis throughout the 60s. But at the same time, their freedom to profess and practice their faith was sought to be restricted. So Akbar was a very typical religiously influenced person who had no tolerance toward anything which should be different from what he considered to be his faith. On the advice of Sheikh Abdullah Nabi, he ordered the exhumation of Mir Murtaza Sharifi Shirazi, a Shia buried in Delhi, for his grave was in the proximity to that of Amir Khusro. Now, if you read even the argument, you will be surprised the kind of argument which has been given. His argument was that a heretic could not be allowed to remain buried so close to the grave of a renowned Sunni saint. It was no doubt an extreme action. Even Badani had criticized it as a very unjust act. Akbar's farman to Abu Sarmad, the muhasib of the Pargana Bilgam, around 1572, directing him to help in eradicating heresy and deviationism from the Pargana, is an indication of that a restrictive attitude towards Shiism continued to persist to the early 70s. So Akbar was not even very friendly to the Shias. He heretic could not, like, you look at the opinion, a heretic could not be buried so close to a grave of a Sunni saint. So this speaks aloud that what the mentality of Akbar was. Akbar had even suppressed Madhavism in 1573 during his campaign in Gujarat. Madhavi leader Bandagi Mian Sheikh Mustafa was arrested and brought in chains to the court for debate and released after 18 months. So I don't see this at all as a sign of any kind of tolerance. Mughal Emperor was Mughal Emperor Akbar actually famously referred to him as Emperor of Islam, Emir of the Faithful, Shadow of God on earth, Abdul Fath Jalaluddin Muhammad Akbar Pasha Ghazi is the most just, most wise, and a most God-fearing ruler. So I'm sure that all the Mughal lovers know that what Ghazi means. So, and this is what he is saying in what is he likes to be said about himself in year 1578. It is 3 years after the concept of Ibadat Khana. So those who say that Akbar was becoming very tolerant after the instance of Ibadat Khana is again disproven by his own statement, and this has here Abul Fazl has been quoted. Now, Akbar has been considered to be very tolerant towards the Hindus, but again the tale is quite different. Uh, there is a long list of the massacres what he has done, and it nowhere seems like a war massacres, which people often tell to be that it was the thing what used to happen that time. It was massacre all around in the world. Like, say for the first instance, we pick up what happened in Gara in 1560-80. For this, let me pick the reference from the Sage Encyclopedia of War, Social Science Perspectives, edited by Paul Joseph. And here he is quoting Abul Fazl. Abul Fazl states that 48,000 Hindus were persecuted at the orders of Akbar. 48,000. One may argue that soldiers always get killed in the war, and hence 8,000 Rajput warriors. Yeah, of the 48,000 what Abul Fazl is quoting, 8,000 are the Rajput warriors. But can Mr. Javed Akhtar or anyone tell me that why he killed 40,000 peasants? What fault was of the peasants and the civilians? Just because they were Kafirs. It is as simple as that. For Akbar, till that time, was very much of a jihadi. Then let's look into what happened during the massacre of Gondwana. In 1564, Akbar conquered the Gondwana kingdom. The territory was ruled over by Raja Veer Narayan. The Raja Veer Narayan was a minor, and his mother Durgavati, who majorly took care of whole of the empire, was a Rajput warrior of the Gonds. Now, Durgavati had to commit the suicide or after the defeat of the Battle of Damu, while Raja Veer was slain at the fall of Chauragarh, the mountain fortress of the Gonds. The Mughals seized immense wealth and thousand elephants. Kamala Devi, a younger sister of Durgavati, was sent to the Mughal harem. So, again, what the Akbar the Great, and if one look to further details of it, Akbar the Great had a very tough time fighting or defeating Virangana Devi Durgavati. And now, if Akbar was at all the man of morality, then why did he send Kamlavati to harem? Now, again, for this, I have pulled out a source from the medieval India, from Sultanate to the Mughals, part 2 by Satish Chandra. So, I think that Satish Chandra should be acceptable to everyone and all the Mughal lovers too. Now, let's talk about the persecutions at Nagarkot. You know, we just can go on and on talking about the persecutions by the tolerant Akbar. Nizamuddin Ahmad Nizamuddin Ahmad recorded the violence during the conquest of Nagarkot, and it is again not very pleasing, where it talks even about the massacre of the cows. The fortress of Bun, which is an idol temple of Mahamai, was taken by Muslim assailants. A party of Rajputs who had resolved to die fought till they were all cut down. So they were fighting very bravely. A number of Brahmins who for many years had served the temple never gave one thought to fight, and they didn't fight that time, and they were slain too. Now, that's okay, they didn't fight or not, but what is the point of slaying the Brahmins? They were the civilians. Had Akbar been tolerant, he wouldn't have killed or massacred the innocent Brahmins. Nearly 200 black cows belonging to the Hindus during the struggle had crowded together for shelter in the temple, and all of them were also killed. Each and every cows too were killed. They didn't leave a single cow to they and if you read it, the further description goes on. It's very painful. They then took off their boots and filled them with the blood and cast it upon the roof and the walls of the temple. So their boots were filled with the blood of the cows and the people killed, and this just cast it upon on the roofs and the walls of the temple. Shame on Akbar's army and the instruction of Akbar. And this I have sourced out from the history of India, as told by its own historians, the Mohammedan period, volume 5. One can definitely go out and read the book. So, and how can one forget this third siege of Chittor? Many temples were destroyed. Akbar was a temple destroyer too. The shrine of Maniddin Chisti in Ajmer was presented brass candlesticks by Akbar, which were taken after the destruction of the Kalika temple during the siege. Bigot, bigot, wasn't he? He was absolutely a bigot. I don't find any action which don't say that he was not a bigot, and so on and on. In September 1567, Akbar left for Chittor, and on 20 October 1567, camped in the vast plains outside the fort. In the meantime, Rana Uday Singh, on the advice of the Council of Advisors, decided to go away from the Chittor to the hills of Wagunda with his family. Jaimal and Patta were left behind to defend the fort, along with the 8,000 warriors and 1,000 musketeers under their command. Akbar laid the siege to the fortress, which lasted for 4 months. 4 months. On 22 February 1568, Jauhar was committed in the house of Patta, Aisar Das and Sahib Khan. Next day, the gates of the fort were opened, and Rajput soldiers rushed out to fight the enemies. In the ensuing battle, 8,000 Rajputs alongside 30,000 peasants were slain. So now further looking into the records, if I have to believe in the words of James Todd, Akbar had the genew of slain collected and weighed for estimate of the killed. It weighed around 200 kg. You understand what 200 kg of the genew would have meant. So just imagine the amount of people massacred. Merciless was our great tolerant Akbar. So again, one needs to read the book Emperors of the Peacock Throne, the saga of the great Mughals by Abraham Mirali. It gives the very account. Now, further going on more to the references of what Akbar was and how his opinion was about the other faiths, and let's look at what Jesuit Father Montserrat Acquaviva and Enrique had to say. They had arrived in the Akbar's court in early 1580, and Montserrat recorded his journey of travelogue and comments that religious zeal of Muslims had destroyed many Hindu temples. So Akbar till that time had no empathy or any kind of good faith for the Hindus. He was on rampage. He was destroying temples, killing out the civilians, and many more. So one must read about these sources too. The play in place of temples, countless tombs and shrines of Muslims have been erected, in which these men are worshipped as if they were saints in the reign of Akbar. And these are the words of a traveler coming to the court of Akbar. Akbar had rewarded Abdul Qadir Badani with gold coins, who soaked his Islamic beard in Hindu infidel blood. You know, it seems interesting that he's rewarding someone for such an act. The gesture of Badani had delighted Akbar the great secularist. This source is being drawn from The Legacy of Jihad, Islamic Holy War, and the Fate of Non-Muslims, edited by Andrew G. Boston. So one can go on and on to even talk about what Akbar the Great was and was he really great. So I I think that I have tried to touch upon most of the important points which completely demystify that neither Akbar was demystify the fact that Akbar was a secularist, and also it further goes on to demystify that Mughals made us rich. This also demystifies completely that Mughals came here to stay back as Indian. Sadar pranam to all of you.